Recording. So first of all, I would like to thank our sponsor for today's shir, for today's discussion, and it is sponsored by Susan Kahn. It is to commemorate the yahrzeit of her father, Joseph Weinstock, Mr. Weinstock, Yaakov Yosef Ben Shia, and it's Bo Bayom. He was Nifter Erev Rosh Hashanah. Jackal of Hashem several times told me the story of the challenge they faced with the P'tira on Erev Rosh Hashanah. So may our limud today, may our Torah study today be a schus for the very special neshama of Yaakov Yosef Ben Shia. And thank you, Susan, for the sponsorship. And please take care. It should be a good year. Aseret Yemei Teshuva. So that's going to be our main focus. Now, when you talk about Aseret Yemei Teshuva, it's 10 days. But when you would turn to someone on Rosh Hashanah, perhaps he's not going to identify the day as Aseret Yemei Teshuva. It's Rosh Hashanah. And when it comes to Yom Kippur, I have a feeling that people don't talk about the fact that it's Aseret Yemei Teshuva, but rather it's Yom Kippur. So it's 10 days, and actually we could say that there are 7 core days. 7 core days of Aseret Yemei Teshuva, and these are significant days. There's a famous drasha given by Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. So this is back in the 18th century, where he notes that this is a period of time during these 10 days when we want to go ahead and fix the flaws of the previous year. And therefore, since the core is 7 days, and you have every day of the week in the core 7 days of Aseret Yemei Teshuva, so therefore, perhaps on the Sunday of Aseret Yemei Teshuva, you focus on areas that need improvement when it comes to your Sundays, and so too when it comes to the Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So this idea that Aseret Yemei Teshuva has a core 7 days makes its appearance in another area, which brings about a lot of discussion. So it works as follows. When once upon a time there was a temple in Jerusalem, there was a Beis Hamikdash, right? You can't deny that. You can't deny it. There was a Beis Hamikdash there. You could turn to our text and our tradition, our Masores, and even to archaeology. And you know that once upon a time there was a Beis Hamikdash. This Beis Hamikdash, this temple in Yerushalayim, was our spiritual hub. It was a hub, and it gave us identity. Now, access to the temple, access to the harabais, played a very important role in a person's life, because when you visited Yerushalayim, you wanted to go as far as you can and as close as you could in different areas of the Temple Mount. And as a result, the laws of purity were ones that the average person was familiar with. For the average person, the laws of Tumah and Tahara were extremely important. Why? Because of this desire to enter the Beis Hamikdash and to eat specific types of meats. So there was an awareness that the whole nation had regarding Tumah and Tahara. And if today in schools they have a brachos bee, in other words, where they test children in 1st and 2nd grade, if they know the bracha on appropriate cereals. In the olden days, people used to eat a lot of cereal for breakfast. Today, kids are upgraded to sushi and wraps. But in the olden days, we used to eat cornflakes and Rice Krispies. So children would know the brachos because it was important for their Jewish identity. I have no doubt that 2,000 years ago, the children would be tested on how knowledgeable they were regarding the laws of Tumah and Tahara, purity and impurity. Now, to such an extent that many people had the practice that they would eat food, regular food, chulin, meaning food that has not been sanctified. It's not truma, it's not maser, it's not kodashim, but nevertheless, they would eat all their food in a state of purity. And they would only use vessels that are not susceptible to tumah, or perhaps that were watched that they shouldn't become tameh. So this concept of eating chulin meaning not sanctified food, b'tahara, played a significant role to many members of our faith, especially the chaverim, the Talmidei Chachamim, The Torah scholars had such a practice. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. But as you know, for many, this loss of the Beis Hamikdash was one that was so devastating that there was a belief that there's no question it will return very, very soon. If you would probably interview the average Jew 20, 30 years after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and you would ask them, when will the Beis Hamikdash be rebuilt? It was not just faith that one day it will be rebuilt. They actually felt that it cannot be that we continue as a nation without it. Now, Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai had a vision and an understanding that we have to go ahead and place something else in the center of our Judaism, which is the study of Torah. But I think for others and for the masses, it was still the temple. As a result, the practice of eating chulin b'tehara, eating all food in a state of purity, continued by many. Now, after the rebellion of Bar Kokhba and the complete devastation of southern Israel between the year 132 and 135, this chulin b'tehara practice started to decline. And less and less people were doing it. It was no longer a central practice, but there were still righteous people that wanted to be in a state of purity with all food consumed. So therefore, you would still find a few that would do it. But the struggle in yeshivot in the year 200 was, should I do chulin b'tara? Should I not do chulin b'tara? That was the shaila people would ask on the internet, would ask their Rebbe, what is the status of continuing with chulin b'tara or not? Now, the Talmud shares with us that the great Rav was a rabbi who lived in Eretz Yisrael in the beginning of the 3rd century, made his way to Babylonia, and changed Judaism forever because he established the yeshivot in Babylonia, and Babylonia took off. And in the beginning, when he left, in the beginning of the 3rd century, around the year 210, it was the end of Eretz Yisrael being the spiritual hub for Torah teachings. Meaning from that point on, Torah was no longer coming forth from Eretz Yisrael. There was Talmud Torah, but the great yeshivot were in Babylonia. And later the great yeshivot were in Spain and in France and in Germany and in Poland. But there was this major shift that occurred when Rav left Eretz Yisrael. I like mentioning the fact that in many ways that changed, meaning by Rav leaving, Torah was no longer centralized in Israel, and that continued until 1986. Because in 1986, with the passing of Rav Moshe Feinstein, we somehow sense that the great Torah leadership and guidance is back to Eretz Yisrael, which is something that you could think about what this era is about, what period we are living in. That aside, Rav is struggling with this issue. Do I eat chulin b'tahara? Do I not eat chulin b'tahara? So the Jerusalem Talmud tells us that he goes to his uncle and spiritual guide, Reb Chia, and he says, Uncle Chia, what do I do? Do I continue? Do I not? And his uncle says to him, you know what? Listen, chulin b'tahara is not a requirement, but perhaps you should try to do it 7 days during the year. Meaning there is a 7-day period when it would be recommended that during that 7-day period, eat your chulin b'tahara. That's the statement in the Jerusalem Talmud. So there's an old tradition that's the 7 days mentioned by Reb Chia to Rav to try to eat chulin b'tahara actually is the 7 core days of Aseret Yemei Teshuva. In other words, on Rosh Hashanah, obviously they ate everything with purity. On Yom Kippur, there's no eating. So when he told them for 7 days, eat chulin b'tahara, it's referring to the Aseret Yemei Teshuva. Okay? Now, we no longer eat our chulin b'tahara, but due to that statement, a great rabbi in the late 11th, early 12th century says to us the following, that you should know. Although chulin b'tahara is not something that is part of our practice of Judaism, but what we see from it is that upgrading your practices, upgrading that which you do is a nice thing and a proper thing to do during Aseret Yemei Teshuva. And as a result, he says, even though we are lenient and we eat bread baked by a baker, known as pat pautar. In other words, the baker bakes bread. I know the ingredients are kosher. I can eat it halachically. It's 100% fine, even though it was not baked by a Jew. However, he notes, on Aseret Yemei Teshuva, it would be recommended and proper to eat only pat Yisrael. On Aseret Yemei Teshuva, you only eat pas Yisrael. That's what he tells us. And as a result, for the past 900 years, we've been taught that you eat bread that has been baked by a Jew during Aseret Yemei Teshuva. So here in Toronto, this is a very easy practice. It is quite easy because every single bakery, if I'm not mistaken, under the COR is Pas Yisrael, right? And therefore, the concern and the significance of this law is one that we just practice with our norm. But if you live in Memphis, Tennessee, you suddenly start asking the question, what bread is considered Pas Yisrael? What bread is not considered Pas Yisrael? So this is something that came in to existence due to the statement of the Ravya. His name was Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel, the great 11th century authority. And it's interesting to note. Now, I would like to share with you the following. When we are told that you have to start or be a little bit more stringent during this period of time, there was a great rabbi, the author of the Aruch HaShulchan, lived about 120 years ago. And he notes that this doesn't mean that you should start suddenly practicing stringencies for 10 days, because that would be something that's really inconsistent with what Judaism is about. We don't believe in playing games during Aseret Yemei Teshuva. We don't want to go ahead and approach God Almighty and say, you know what, I'm machmer now, but I'm going to go back to the norm after Yom Kippur. Specifically when it comes to Pas Yisrael, specifically when it comes to bread, that everyone agrees that it's kosher even if it's not baked by a Jew, specifically in an area where there is no halachic question, but rather a clear understanding that it is a stringency, there such a minhag developed. But a person, for example, should not suddenly start keeping Chol Yisrael only for those 10 days. This is something that is mentioned, but this is a little bit of an idea of the discussion that relates to Pas Yisrael. Now, talking about Aseret Yemei Teshuva, before we continue, I'd like to talk about the first day, the day after Rosh Hashanah, which is called Tzom Gedalia. It's a fast day. It's a minor fast day, and therefore, in no way should it be compared to Yom Kippur. And many halachic authorities note that an individual that knows that by fasting on Tzom Gedalia, he or she will have difficulty fasting on Yom Kippur, they should not fast on Tzom Gedalia. So keep it in perspective. But I think Tzom Gedalia carries a very important message as it relates to this period of time. And what do I mean by that? The story of Gedalia, you know, that this is, he lived right after the destruction of the first temple, where the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael was devastated. No one was left really, no one to lead them. But due to the kindness of the Almighty, they were left with this righteous leader by the name of Gedaliah ben Achikam. Gedaliah the righteous was officially granted permission to stay and lead a community in Eretz Yisrael by the Babylonians. And this was very uplifting. It symbolized continuity in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the problem is that as he was present there were politics in the region, and there was a king, an Ammonite king by the name of Baalis, who was not happy with his presence there, and he hired another Jew to kill him, a Jew by the name of Yishmael. Now, Yishmael's intention was picked up by someone by the name of Yochanan. Maybe he worked for the Mossad, I don't know. But this Yochanan got the news that there is there's going to be an attempt on the life of the righteous Gedalia. And he walks over to Gedalia and he says to him, you should know, Gedaliah, they're planning to kill you. I know it for a fact. You as a leader, give me permission to protect you by executing the fellow Yochanan, who was Ishmael, who was designated for the assassination. Gedaliah was a righteous person, and he was not willing to accept the Lashon Hara. So Gedaliah turns to Yochanan and he says, Al ta'aseh hadavar hazeh. I don't accept the fact that another Jew is going to try to kill me. Ki sheker ata dover al Ishmael. What you are saying regarding Ishmael is simply not true. Unfortunately, it was true. And unfortunately, Gedaliah and others were killed. And the Talmud derives from it the following. You know, Lashon Hara, we talk about the sensitivity of not tuning in to negativity about others. And it's very, very Jewish, right? That Lashon Hara, we have to have an awareness not to speak it. We have to have the awareness not to hear it. But it doesn't mean you have to be a fool. In other words, if there is news that relates to your welfare, tune in. Don't ignore it. In other words, yes, it's good to be frum, but it's also important to use your seichel, to use your common sense. And the rabbis are critical of this righteous Gedaliah for not tuning into this Yochanan. There was a warning. There was a warning that related not just to your life, Gedaliah, but it related and was relevant for others as well. Just as there's a prohibition of listening and speaking Lashon Hara, there is at times a prohibition from ignoring facts. And therefore, if someone, for example, asks you information about someone, they want to hire them, they want to enter into a business partnership, and you know for a fact, you have no doubt that he's a crook, that he's dishonest, that he's a terrible person, you have an obligation to say something. Obviously, you do it with the right intention and you don't add, and the information has to be clear to you and not hearsay. But nevertheless, yes, we focus a lot during this period of time on growth, but let's focus on common sense as well. And it's interesting that as you walk in to Aseret Yemei Teshuva, and yes, it's a period of time when we focus a lot on Ben Adam Lechavero. We say often the fact, God is very forgiving, right? God is a very easy entity, right? He did not have a complex background, meaning his childhood was good. He didn't have a childhood. He has no complexes. He doesn't need therapy. So if you honestly feel that you want to reconnect with the Almighty, mission accomplished. Humans are very complex, right? Very, very complex entities. Because even when you want to go ahead and reconnect and ask them for forgiveness, boy, you have to deal with how they felt, and it's far more complex to deal with humans. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us that during this Aseret Yemei Teshuva period, and it's in Shulchan Aruch, focus on asking forgiveness. Be a forgiving person, right? Realize that let's walk into this period of time with unity, and it is achieved by at times overcoming those emotions. We are complex entities, but at the same time, we were given the tools to overcome those complexities, right? So we focus a lot on these social interactions. We focus on Lashon Hara. No question. This is a period of time to focus on those words that come out of our mouth, right? It's pointed out that if you look at the Al-Chaitz that we're going to be saying on Erev Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur, 25% relate to speech. And so much damage is done by speech. We all know that. But there are times you got to speak up. Listen to the story of Gedaliah. And that's what we are mindful of as we enter into Aseret Yemei Teshuva. Think about Gedaliah. Think about the tragedy because he didn't listen. Sometimes you have to listen. You have to know what's going on around you. So that's a message, at least that's, in my opinion, an important one as we enter into Aseret Yemei Teshuva. Now, it's always important that when it comes to the minhagim, and there are many, many minhagim, important they are, but we can't emphasize too much. We can't focus too much on them. And it can be damaging. You know, like every child is taught that during this period of time, we don't eat nuts. You've heard it, right? That you don't eat the egos. Why do you not eat nuts during, I don't know, either Rosh Hashanah or Aseret Yemei Teshuva or on Simchas Torah or Tul Chanukah? Why is there such a practice? And you're told that it is because the numerical value of egoz, which is a nut, a filbert or a hazelnut, is chet. And if you think through it, it doesn't border on absurdity, right? If you think through it, it makes no sense at all, right? So obviously there has to be something deeper there. And, you know, in some circles, and I'm sure in Hasidic circles and some of the Hungarian circles, this is something that's very, very holy. I come from the school that, yes, it's a minhag Yisrael and we do it. However, I am comfortable to analyze it and therefore minimize it. What do I mean by that? The Chassam Sofer explains the following, that you should know that it is possible that the reason there was such a practice of not eating nuts is because people would eat nuts, cough a little bit, which it does bring up some phlegm. And during Tkiyah Shofar, when you're supposed to tune into the sounds, we don't want people coughing up phlegm. So therefore, it says the Chassam Sofer, due to the fact that that is the reason for not eating the nuts, so therefore, after Tkiyas Shofar of day 2, if you eat some nuts, it's not such a big deal, okay? So we try to minimize it while respecting it. And so too, I always get these shilas of someone grounded some nuts and it was put in a cake. Can I eat it on Rosh Hashanah? Okay, it's nice to be concerned about the minhag, but that's not the essence of the day. I just got a question a half an hour ago of someone that made a recipe with their meat and it had a little bit of apple cider vinegar. What's the status for Rosh Hashanah? Is it okay or not? So these are shilas that are asked, but we have to understand, nice they are, significant they are, they're part of our tradition. They're not the essence of the period. Let's keep that in mind. So in Telz, when they would serve on Rosh Hashanah gefilte fish, they would have chrein, which in other communities they don't. And the question would be asked, why is there chrein? The minhag is not to eat things that are, if it's sour or a tart, vinegar. And Telz, they say the following, that on Rosh Hashanah you have to eat fish. And the Jewish fish is gefilte fish. And fish without chrein is not fish. So therefore in Telz, they ate chrein. So it indicates that you could tell that I come from an environment where the emphasis is more on developing self, focusing on tefillah, commitment to Talmud Torah. But when it comes to the foods, nice, yes, but don't make it fundamental. My late Rebbe, Rabbi Keller, used to always say that people should know that the numerical value of chet is chet. The numerical value of sin is sin. In other words, be careful not to sin. Don't insult someone on Aseret Yemei Teshuva. Don't be harsh with someone else, because the numerical value of sin is sin. So obviously he was being a little bit facetious with the connection to numerical and gematriot to determine our practices. So my recommendation is stick to your minhagim. Minhagim are beautiful, especially if you cite at home and you connect to the past and you can bring it forth to the future. Minhagim are great, but let's not allow it to become the essence and the core. And also when it comes like sometimes to tefillah, in other words, you're in a shul, right? You're in a shul, and a person saying Kaddish, and he says La'ela during Aseret Yemei Teshuva, and he forgot to say La'ela, La'ela. And everyone cries out, La'ela, La'ela, meaning you made this terrible sin, you did not repeat the word in Kaddish of La'ela twice. Is it so terrible? My feeling is that not. I personally think that as Kaddish was formulated, probably some 900, 1,000 years ago, there were two nuschaot, there were two different versions. One version had La'ela, and one of them had La'ela, La'ela throughout the year. That's the feeling I have. And then at some point, some communities said, you know what, let's go with La'ela, La'ela, like Yemenites. The Yemenites say La'ela, La'ela throughout the year. And then there are others that always say just La'ela. But then there were some communities that said, let's make some kind of compromise. So for example, in some German communities, they said La'ela, La'ela only on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, not all of us Aseret Yemei Teshuva. In some German communities, they said La'ela, La'ela on every Yom Tov. So you realize that this is not something that is going to put an end to the world. If a person, imagine you have a person saying Kaddish, it's a difficult time, and the whole shul crying out, say Layla, Layla twice. These are not the most fundamental parts. Important, yes, it's nice to have minhagim, it's nice to have a nusach, but let's be mindful of something that's far greater, right? The ben adam lechavero. And when we talk about minhagim and davening, I remember it tells yeshiva, we would say LeDavid Hashem Ori Veishi Shachris, right? It's the 27th chapter of Tehillim. It's a beautiful chapter because David HaMelech cries out to God and he asks him for one thing, to sit in the house of God, which indicates what we are supposed to be about. What are our desires, right? What is my desire? Is it wealth? Is it the private plane? Is it comfort? Or is it a relationship with the higher being, a spiritual relationship? So we read that magnificent 27th chapter, which is supposed to remind us of how we connect to God. And it talks about God as a light. He is a light. He gives us clarity. I know very well, you interact with older people. If people live their life with that light, old age is something that's meaningful because life continues. If your whole goal is youth and excitement, and your goal is, there's a store in the mall, I think it's going out of business, called Forever 21, right? And that seems to be an ideal of people. I want to be 21 forever. Why? Because youth is exciting, you have desires, you can fulfill them. If that's your essence, so what happens when you're 81? You know, what is life? The Ori, and God is our salvation, right? Yom Kippur brings about salvation. Rosh Hashanah gives us light. So the 27th chapter of Tehillim LeDavid is a beautiful one. We say it, we think through it. So in Tells, they had the following practice: to only say it in the morning, not at night, to only say it during the week. They never said it Shabbos and they never said it Rosh Hashanah and not Yom Kippur, and only to say it up until Yom Kippur, not to say it afterwards. That was the Tells practice. And I do remember at the time, I was 17 and I was sitting next to a fellow by the name of Yitzi Shur, and he felt uncomfortable that Tells is not doing the minhag that he had at home. So after every Ma'ariv during Elul, he would say LeDavid, because how can I go ahead and not say LeDavid? As I got older and I started researching how the Tells minhag developed, I realized something quite magnificent, and it works as follows. The idea of saying LeDavid is actually quite recent. It is only 300 years old, meaning it only appeared in print. So probably people have been doing it for longer. But in printed text, to say this chapter throughout the month of Elul, until Shmini Atzeres, only makes its appearance, I think it was 1706, it makes its first appearance. So now it was presented by mystics, claiming, and people who felt that it accomplishes things in the spiritual realm, no question about it. But the question was for people who are less mystical, for those who are pure litvaks, should I say it or not say it? And that was actually the struggle in the 18th century. Do we say it as these mystics tell us that we have to say it until Shmini Atzeres, or perhaps not, because it was not said by earlier authorities? So great rabbis like the Gaon of Vilna believed it's not something to be said. There's no such practice. There's no such Mesorah. On the other hand, there were other communities in Lithuania that felt, listen, it's being done, let's do it. But let's compromise. We don't have to do it always. We don't have to do it at night. And in addition, we've talked about this in the past, that for the Kabbalist, the din continues past Yom Kippur up until Shmini Atzeres. For those who don't follow that school, it ends with Yom Kippur. And therefore, the tradition they had in Tells originates in communities that had that understanding that, yes, it's a nice practice to say LeDavid, but it ends with Yom Kippur because the din, the judgment, ends with Yom Kippur. So minhagim are important, and to study them gives you an appreciation for the past. But what is fundamental is the idea and understanding that that's not the essence of the period. And in other words, if someone went ahead and ate his nuts, right, and someone went ahead and didn't follow specific minhagim that relate to food, but was sensitive to ask mechila, forgiveness from someone he hurt, I think we could all agree that that's really an accomplishment for this period of time. You know, when we talk about a minhagim, kaparos is one that there's a lot of discussion, right? A lot of discussion regarding kaparos, and I've mentioned in the past that in early Sephardi communities, when I mean early Sephardi communities, if I would interview a Sephardi authority from 500 years ago, and I would ask him, Chacham, tell me, do you do kaparot? And he would say, God forbid. God forbid. It's a foolish minhag. That's what a Sephardi, if I would ask him 500 years ago. If I would turn to a descendant of that Sephardi 250 years later, meaning 250 years ago, and I ask him, do you do kaparot? He would say 100%. What do you mean? It's a holy minhag. And you ask, what changed exactly? What exactly changed? So what's interesting about kaparot is the fact that actually it originated in European communities, in Eastern Europe, right? And it was done that you take the chicken and you swing it around your head, and that brings about an atonement. When great rabbis in Spain found out about it in the early 14th century, they viewed it as a problematic practice. Since it does not appear in Talmudic sources, this is something that should not be done, right? And they labeled it perhaps as a darkei amorim, meaning a practice that's not rational and not part of our tradition, in general, is something that's avoided. Now, so therefore, if we move forward into the 16th century, so Rabbi Yosef Karo in Shulchan Aruch calls this practice a minhag shtut. He calls it a foolish practice. On the other hand, Ramosha Isserlis in Poland in the middle of the 16th century says it is something that we do. It is something that we do with chickens. You get a male for a male, female for a female. In other words, the guidelines of how to do proper kaparot was mentioned by this great Ashkenazi authority. And as a result, it brought about trouble, meaning the kaparot practice was quite easy when people lived in villages and they were anyway eating chicken. And most probably the chicken that they ate Erev Yom Kippur, the day before, was running around the yard. The shochet showed up in the morning, and the next thing they know is that they have a meal. So if you're anyway going to shecht it, it's not so hard to take the chicken, swing it around your head, together with the chicken, read Bnei Yadam, read the verses, and mission accomplished. But as they moved into towns in the 18th century, they moved into towns in the 19th century, and suddenly not everyone has access to the chickens, and the shochet is one that there's one for many, many. There were a series of problems that developed because many people tried to shech their kaporas Erev Yom Kippur, the ideal time for the Kabbalists, and the shochtim were doing tremendous amounts from early in the morning. And as you know very well, a sakin, the knife, the chalif of the shochet has to be sharp. And if there's a nick, it disqualifies the chicken. It becomes non-kosher. And if you have a burden shochet, there's a very strong possibility that some of those chickens are going to be not kosher. Many problems developed with the practice of kaparot. And so too, you move into the 20th century, there's also issues. If you do follow sometimes the news, PETA is not happy with it, if we are being ethical. So there's a discussion about that as well. But this Ashkenazi practice suddenly was adopted by the Kabbalists in Tzfat in the 16th century. And therefore, for the Sephardim who started following the teachings of the Arizal from the early 17th century on, kaparot suddenly become a Sephardi practice as well. So it's interesting. It starts off by the Ashkenazim. It becomes the norm for the Sephardim. And then for us Ashkenazim who have roots in the school of the Balei Musar, who minimize these external acts. So I, of course, come from such a school that obviously it's a minhag Yisrael. I do kaparot. But instead of doing it with a chicken, I'll do it with $1 or $2 or $5 or $20, meaning I'll do it with money. And there are many benefits of doing it with money. You don't have an issue with shchita. You don't have an issue that you're concerned that the chicken is going to take care of its needs as you are swinging it around your head. So therefore, this is the recommended practice where you could stick to a minhag Yisrael, but you realize that this is not the essence of the period of time. So obviously, every person should follow their minhag. If you don't have a minhag, there's no need to start now doing the kaparas with chickens. Many people tell me they have memories from their childhood of doing it. And if for some it's a way of connecting with the next generation, gesundheit, that's wonderful. But again, that should not be what the core essence of this period of time is all about. When a few people already, I had discussions about Kol Nidre. It seems to me that it's a popular question that people ask. Many people are not making their way to shul during this high holiday season. And I think we all agree, V'nishmartem me'ol lenafshosechem. In other words, a person who is not going out to supermarkets and not going out to stores because they are concerned, and you decide not to come to shul, it is a great mitzvah because you're taking care of yourself. Obviously, a person who feels comfortable going to stores and into malls, obviously a shul should be no different. But a person who in general is careful, you are doing the greatest of all mitzvah. And even if you are in doubt, so there's a section in Shulchan Aruch that talks about a person on Yom Kippur that he's not sure if he should fast or not. And 2 doctors say he should fast and 2 doctors say he should not. So you are machmir not to fast because your health is a priority. So this is something that obviously is followed by many, and we should merit to no longer have such questions. But many people are wondering a little bit about Kol Nidre, because Kol Nidre night is a time you come to shul. Kol Nidre night is so important that if you ask my mishpacha, Al Jolson, in the jazz singer, that was the moment that the chazan knew that there's continuity when the jazz singer was singing Kol Nidre nights, right? It was the first talkie movie. I think it's 1927. Not that I remember things from 1927, but a little bit of history I do know. Kol Nidre night signified the night we connect to our tradition. Nevertheless, Kol Nidre itself, there's a little bit of a question what it's all about, right? Is it nullifying vows of the past? Is it a statement to nullify vows of the future? Okay, that's unclear. I always see it as a night when we stand there and we meditate about the power of speech. And I think as we enter into this season, and especially Yom Kippur, it is a time to think about speech, how powerful it is. We humans are the only ones that could communicate our own ideas through speech. We could create with speech, right? We're not parrots. We're not parrots could also speak, but they only mimic, right? I saw online the other day that there was a lawyer who was dealing with a couple, and they were fighting over the parrot because the parrot would be spending time with one of the, with the male, with the husband, and he would say nasty things about the wife. And then the parrot would be spending time by the wife, and the parrot would be mimicking, you're a nasty person, in other words. So she started doing it and saying nasty things about the husband, and the parrot would mimic it. And the guy says, Nebuch, this is what I went to law school for, that I have to deal with a couple that are fighting over their parrot. We are not parrots, right? We don't mimic things. We create through speech. And speech is powerful. And to prove to you that speech is powerful, think about once you got insulted and hurt by someone's speech. Okay, close your eyes, you got hurt. Look at the power of speech. Now, if it could do bad, we have a rule in our tradition that the attribute of good is far greater than the attribute of bad. So imagine what we could accomplish with speech. Words of Torah, words of encouragement, and a conversation with the higher being. God Almighty wants us to talk to him, right? It is fundamental to believe it as we walk into this season. God wants us to say, you are the king. He wants us to feel it. Speech is significant. So as we enter into Yom Kippur and we talk about vows, what are vows? Vows means that just as that treif, that non-kosher piece of meat is prohibited, if I take a kosher piece of meat and I say, this is prohibited upon me like chazer, I have the power with my speech to create laws and regulations that are comparable to Torah. Do you realize how powerful my mouth is? The neder, the vow, teaches me speech is significant. And that's the message we are supposed to walk into this season. And that's how we walk into Yom Kippur. Nidre, Yisarei, Koname, all these different types of vows recognize speech. So utilize it. Utilize it by talking to God. Utilize it by asking him for forgiveness through speech, because you're supposed to verbalize that emotion. And yes, utilize it to turn to someone else and say, listen, this has not been good. I've been not so nice to you this past year. I ask you for forgiveness. I want to reconnect. That's how I view Kol Nidre night. But at a time when a person cannot come to shul, it is important to remember you could achieve the Kol Nidre experience by sitting at home, reading those words, thinking about it. It's an avoda shebalev, it's a tefillah, is a service that is done in the heart, and it could be achieved at home. It is not a must to be in shul. Obviously, when years are good, you do that, and obviously those who can do it, but zero guilt has to be part of your Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. If for whatever reason you're concerned that the social gathering is a problem, worry not. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is shomea tfilas kol peh in every single location. So these are a few thoughts that I have about Aseret Yemei Teshuva. And we talk often about the mitzvah, Erev Yom Kippur, there's a mitzvah to eat. There's a mitzvah to eat. When I was a child, I was once visiting my great uncle, Rabbi Yitzchak Kolitz. Rabbi Yitzchak Kolitz. Rabbi Yitzchak Kolitz, you're one of those individuals that as a child makes a significant impact on you. He was my grandmother's younger brother. He was a tremendous Torah scholar, a great Torah scholar. And he, besides his knowledge in Torah, he was very good with, he was a people person. He was a people person, and he treated every single human being with dignity and sensitivity, Jews and Gentiles alike. And in 1983, I think it was, he became the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. And it was a big covet for my family. We were very honored. I remember going to the party where we were celebrating the fact that he was chosen as rabbi. And my grandmother used to call my uncle, Rabbi Yitzchak, Itzaleh. Now, Itzaleh is a nice way to call maybe a 4-year-old, and she basically, she was about a good 15 years older than him, so she would call him out Yitzaleh, but the problem was that I was a child at the time, and I too would sometimes call him Yitzaleh. And I remember the look I would get from my father, here's the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, and you have the chutzpah of calling him Yitzaleh. But my grandmother was always talking about Yitzaleh. I did the same. Eventually, I learned that I don't call the chief rabbi Yitzaleh. But Yitzaleh had this way of connecting to people. It was actually utilized by the state of Israel at one point, because there was a situation, I think it was in Hamburg, that there was an old cemetery in Hamburg that the Nazis destroyed completely. And after the war, in the late 1940s, some corporation turned to the community there in Hamburg and asked them to purchase the land. There was nothing left, but they knew it was a cemetery. Unfortunately, the Jews in Hamburg at that time were not originally from Hamburg and felt no connection to the city, and they needed the money. So therefore, they accepted the offer, and they sold the rights to the land to this corporation. And the corporation let the land sit for a good 3 decades. Eventually, in the early 1980s, they decided to develop the land and build a mall there. So they started construction, but the word got to Israel that they're digging up an old cemetery, and it's done by Germans. So the Chassidim and the Yerushalmis and the Frum community went berserk, and they started flying in protesters to Germany. Germans didn't know how to deal with it because they had legal right over the land. On the other hand, they were sensitive to the PR that it won't be looking good if German officials are arresting Jews. So therefore, they needed someone to bring forth a compromise. Now, the problem was that it would be quite challenging to find a compromise when you're dealing with really people from two extremes. So my uncle, Rabbi Yitzchak Kolitz, was chosen. And it was noted that he was the only one that was able to, on the one hand, satisfy, the Haredim in Israel with halachic basis. They respected him as a tremendous Torah scholar, that whatever solution he brings forth will be respected. And at the same time, he was able to communicate with these officials, German officials, and the members of this, or officers and CEOs of this corporation, and he came up with a solution where they elevated them all and they created a gap between the actual soil and the floor, and somehow he was able to satisfy all parties. So this was a very, very special person, and one of my few interactions on halachic matters that I remember with him, he asked me the following question as a child. He said to me, there's a mitzvah to eat Erev Yom Kippur. There's a mitzvah to eat, there's a mitzvah not to eat on Yom Kippur. You get that? You eat Erev Yom Kippur, you don't eat on Yom Kippur. So Rabbi Yitzchak Yitzchak asked me the question, what's considered a harder mitzvah? So as a child, I think I gave what appeared as an 8, 9-year-old. I said, listen, it's hard to fast on Yom Kippur. He said, actually, as a mitzvah, it's harder to eat Erev Yom Kippur. Why? Because when you fast, you sense you are fasting, right? You sense I'm doing a mitzvah. Erev Yom Kippur, when you eat, you have a desire to eat. The mind does not treat it as a mitzvah. That makes it a more difficult mitzvah. That's what he noted. And it's something I think of Erev Yom Kippur, that it's indeed a privilege that my eating Erev Yom Kippur is really part of my service. I am fulfilling the mitzvah of Hashem, like the Sefer HaChinuch notes, that the Almighty recognizes us as humans. And the fact that we're not going to be eating for 24, 25 hours is difficult. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with his mercy, doesn't want it to be more difficult than needed. So therefore, he tells us, please, my children, eat Erev Yom Kippur. And that's the mitzvah. We're doing the mitzvah because our Father in heaven wants us not to have it too difficult on Yom Kippur itself. Therefore, it is a mitzvah that requires the mind to be activated. And it's really a symbol for this season. This is a season we're going to be doing incredible things, but we have to be sure that the mind operates well. And even though it's going to be a shorter gathering in shul, and even though some of us are going to be outdoors, and perhaps some of the nigunim we're not going to hear this year, let the mind, let the operating mind and the broken heart work together, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should hear our tefillos. And may it be indeed that due to the fact that this year we walk into the high holiday season with a recognition that there's what to daven for. A year ago, we had no idea what to daven for. Now we do. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Shomei Tfilas Kol Peh, and it should be a time that we utilize these Aseret Yemei Teshuva with the essence of the period of time, right? A commitment to do good to one another and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be mindful of our tefillos, and to go ahead and do Teshuva. And hopefully, as a result, we should merit a really, really good year. So I thank Susan very much for sponsoring. And may the very special neshama have an aliyah from our limud Torah and from our growth. And I thank everyone for participating. It's very nice to be here speaking and learning together. And the opportunities continue. We're going to have next week on Wednesday morning what we call a Shabbos Teshuva Drasha. And then next week, Thursday night, the same. It's going to be focused more on Yom Kippur proper and beyond. So that's the goal. For now, we're going to unmute everyone. And we're going to stop